The radio crackled once, then again, then a third time, and this time the voice on the other end was calm, too calm for what was happening. Somewhere in the fog-soaked fields of northern France, a column of American Sherman tanks had rolled directly into a German ambush. It was the summer of 1944. The Normandy breakout was underway, and for the first few seconds of that ambush, it looked like a slaughter. The lead tank took a hit. Smoke poured from the turret. The crew bailed out and hit the mud running. German panzer crews, hidden behind a tree line barely 400 yards away, expected the rest of the American column to do what most armies did: scatter, stall, or freeze, while commanders tried to figure out what was happening. That is not what happened. Within seconds, every Sherman in that column knew exactly where the enemy fire had come from. The second tank in line had already relayed the position. The third tank was already pivoting. An artillery liaison officer 3 miles back was already receiving coordinates. Overhead, an American spotter plane had already been alerted. The Germans expected confusion. They got coordination instead. And that single difference, that invisible, misunderstood difference, would help determine the outcome of an entire campaign. Most people who study World War II focus on the guns, the armor, the horsepower, the kill ratios. And by those measurements, the American Sherman tank was not the most impressive machine on the European battlefield. It was not the heaviest. It was not the most heavily armored. It could not match the frontal armor of a German Tiger or the powerful gun of a Panther at long range. The Germans knew this. They studied it. They laughed at it at times. They called the Sherman a death trap. They had a nickname for it, the Tommy Cooker, borrowed from the British, a dark reference to how quickly the tank's fuel could ignite when hit. American soldiers had their own darker version of the same joke. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter with the slogan that promised it lit every time. But the Germans who studied the Sherman's weaknesses never fully understood its greatest strength. They were looking at the armor plating. They should have been listening to the radio. To understand why this mattered so deeply, you have to go back to before the war. You have to go back to the early 1930s, when the United States Army had almost no tank force worth speaking of, and very little money to build one. America was in the depths of the Great Depression. Military budgets had been gutted. The Army was trying to maintain readiness on almost nothing. But even in those lean years, a small group of officers and engineers were thinking hard about the future of warfare. They had studied the chaos of World War I. They had seen how the early use of tanks had been brilliant in concept, but ragged in execution. Tanks would break through a line and then simply disappear, cut off from infantry, cut off from artillery, cut off from command. No one knew where they were. No one could redirect them in real time. The breakthrough would stall. The opportunity would be lost. These officers concluded that the single most important problem in armored warfare was not firepower, it was not armor, it was communication. If you could not talk to your tanks while they were moving and fighting, you could not coordinate them. And if you could not coordinate them, all the firepower in the world was just noise. This was not a popular conclusion. It was not glamorous. Nobody built a monument to a radio antenna. But a small number of Americans began investing serious intellectual and eventually financial effort into solving this problem. The answer they arrived at was the SCR-508, and later its more advanced cousin, the SCR-528. These were FM radio systems. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Most military radios at that time, including the ones used by the German Army well into the war, relied on AM signals, amplitude modulation. AM radio works reasonably well in calm conditions, but in a battlefield environment, surrounded by the electromagnetic chaos of engines, artillery explosions, static electricity, and deliberate enemy jamming, AM radio was deeply unreliable. Signals faded. Voices became garbled. Commanders issued orders that never arrived, or arrived as fragments too broken to act on. FM radio, frequency modulation, was far more resistant to interference. The signal was cleaner, the voice quality was clearer, it was harder to jam, and critically, it allowed multiple units on different frequencies to communicate simultaneously without bleeding into each other. A tank commander could talk to his platoon on one frequency, switch to another to talk to infantry, and switch again to reach artillery, all within seconds, all with a clarity that AM simply could not match. The United States Army began equipping its tanks and armored vehicles with FM radios before the war even started for America. By the time Sherman tanks began rolling off assembly lines in 1942, every one of them carried an FM radio set as standard equipment, not as an upgrade, not as a special modification, as the baseline, as the thing that was simply always there. This was not true for the Germans. The Wehrmacht entered the war with radios in its tanks, and in the early years that gave them a genuine advantage over enemies who had almost no tank communication systems at all. Against Polish cavalry and French armor in 1939 and 1940, the German radio coordination had been devastatingly effective. But the German system had limits. Many German tanks, particularly in the early war period, carried only a receiver, meaning the crew could hear orders but could not transmit back. Only platoon and company commanders had full two-way radios. Information traveled in one direction, adjustments were slow, and as the war expanded and the Allies began fielding more sophisticated equipment, the German radio advantage quietly began to erode. By 1944, the gap had reversed. American Sherman tanks each had a radio that could both send and receive. Every tank commander had a voice in the conversation. When a tank spotted an enemy position, it didn't have to wait for a commander to pass the information up the chain and then back down again. The information moved instantly and horizontally, spreading across the entire unit in seconds. The implications were enormous.
Consider artillery support. In World War II, artillery was the dominant killer on every front. More soldiers died from artillery fire than from any other weapon. The side that could call in accurate artillery fastest had a profound tactical advantage. And the key word there is accurate, because artillery without accurate targeting information is just noise and destruction without purpose. American armored units had forward artillery observers who moved with the tanks. These observers had their own radios tuned to artillery frequencies. When tanks made contact with the enemy, the observer could immediately relay grid coordinates to the artillery batteries in the rear. The guns could be on target within minutes, sometimes faster. German forces found this deeply unsettling. Time and again, German units that believed they had established a strong defensive position would find themselves suddenly under accurate artillery fire within minutes of engaging American armor. They hadn't seen a spotter plane. They hadn't heard any visible radio traffic. They didn't understand how the Americans had called it in so fast. They were looking for the observation post. They should have been listening for the radio frequency. But FM radio meant they couldn't listen effectively. The German signal intercept units that had performed so well earlier in the war found American FM communications dramatically harder to exploit. You could detect that a transmission was happening. You could not easily decode it or jam it with the equipment most German units had available in the field. The Americans were essentially having conversations in a room the Germans couldn't enter. This played out with brutal clarity during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy hedgerows in late July of 1944. For weeks before Cobra, American armored units had been grinding through the bocage, the dense, ancient hedgerow country of Normandy that turned every field into a fortress and every sunken lane into a killing ground. The terrain was nightmarish for armor. Tanks couldn't see, they couldn't maneuver, they were vulnerable to German infantry with Panzerfausts hiding in the hedges just a few yards away. The fighting was brutal, close, and costly. But during those weeks of grinding hedgerow combat, something was happening that wasn't visible on the casualty reports. American commanders were learning. Their radio networks were developing. Tank platoons were figuring out how to coordinate with infantry, with artillery, with engineers. The communication architecture was being stress-tested and refined under fire. Every failure was analyzed. Every success was shared across the net. When Cobra kicked off on July 25, 1944, American armor punched through the German line and began moving fast. And now the radio advantage became decisive. As German defensive positions began to crumble, their units faced a crisis of communication. Withdrawal orders were slow, units were cut off, commanders lost contact with their subordinate forces. The situation changed faster than the German command structure could process it. Messages that should have taken minutes were taking hours. By the time orders arrived, the situation had changed completely. The Americans were moving on a different clock. Tank commanders were talking to each other in real time. A column that ran into resistance on one road could immediately warn other columns. A unit that found a gap in the German line could immediately communicate it up the chain. Opportunities were exploited within minutes of being identified, not hours. General George Patton, who took command of Third Army during the breakout, understood this intimately. Patton was many things: theatrical, controversial, brilliant, and at times infuriating. But he grasped the relationship between communication speed and battlefield speed more intuitively than almost any other commander in the war. He pushed his armored columns to move at a pace that other generals thought was reckless. He could do this partly because of his own aggressive temperament, but also because his radio network let him maintain real command of widely dispersed, fast-moving units in a way that simply had not been possible in previous wars. His commanders could tell him what they were seeing. He could redirect them in real time. The entire Third Army moved like a single organism with a functioning nervous system, and that nervous system was FM radio. The Germans facing Patton's advance were not in most cases cowards or poor soldiers. Many of them were veterans of years of brutal fighting. They knew their business. But they were fighting an enemy who could coordinate faster, respond faster, and exploit opportunities faster than they could counter them. And much of that advantage was invisible. It was in the frequencies. It was in the antennas mounted on the backs of those Sherman turrets. It was in the voices that moved across clean FM channels while German commanders were still trying to decipher garbled AM messages through static. There's a human dimension to this that gets lost when we talk about technical specifications. Think about what it felt like to be a Sherman crew in the middle of a tank engagement, knowing that your radio worked, knowing that if you spotted something, you could tell someone, knowing that if you were in trouble, you could call for help and be heard clearly, knowing that artillery was listening, knowing that your platoon commander was on the net and hearing everything in real time. Then think about what it felt like on the other side. German tank crews, particularly later in the war when their supply lines were disrupted and equipment was increasingly degraded, sometimes fought with radios that barely functioned. Communication was by hand signal, by messenger, by flag. In the confusion of battle, units lost touch with each other and with their commanders. Decisions that should have taken seconds took minutes, minutes that cost lives.
There's a particular kind of fear that comes from fighting blind, from not knowing where your flanks are, from not knowing if reinforcements are coming or if they've already been destroyed. American crews were not immune to fear. No one in combat is. But they had information. They could hear their commanders. They could hear the wider picture developing around them. That is a profound psychological difference, and it affected performance in ways that no after-action report can fully capture. The German High Command understood by 1944, and certainly by 1945, that they were losing the communication war. Intelligence reports noted the sophistication of American radio discipline. German signals officers wrote assessments acknowledging the superiority of American FM equipment. But acknowledgement and solution are two different things. Retooling an entire military communication infrastructure in the middle of a desperate war, while factories were being bombed and supply chains were collapsing, was not a problem that could simply be solved by recognizing it. By the time German engineers and commanders fully grasped the scope of what they were facing, the war was already decided. The Sherman tank ended the war with a mixed legacy in popular history. The stories of Tigers destroying columns of Shermans from long range are true, and they are dramatic. The casualty rates among Sherman crews were real, and they were terrible. None of that is diminished by understanding the radio advantage. War is not a controlled experiment. Men died in Shermans because of thin armor. That is a fact. But the Sherman also helped win the war, not despite its limitations, but alongside its strengths. And one of its greatest strengths was something most people never thought about, and the Germans never fully understood until it was too late. The numbers tell part of the story. American tank production during the war was staggering, nearly 50,000 Shermans by war's end, compared to roughly 1,300 Tigers and around 6,000 Panthers. But production numbers alone don't explain battlefield effectiveness. What the numbers don't show is the network. The fact that 50,000 Shermans with radios were not just 50,000 individual tanks, they were 50,000 nodes in a communications web that had no equivalent on the German side. Each one of those tanks could talk, each one could listen, each one could pass information sideways, forward, and backward across the battlefield in seconds. The whole was not just greater than the sum of its parts, it was a fundamentally different kind of force, a networked force, decades before that word became the military doctrine it is today. The American Army of World War II was, in many respects, the ancestor of the network-centric warfare concepts that would dominate military thinking in the late 20th century and beyond. The lessons learned in those French fields and German forests, that speed of information matters as much as speed of movement, that coordination multiplies combat power, that the side with the cleaner communication wins not just individual battles, but the tempo of the entire campaign. Those lessons would be studied and restudied in every war college and command school for generations. It started with a radio. A clean FM signal, a voice that cut through the static. It started with engineers and officers in the 1930s who decided that the most important problem in armored warfare was not the gun or the armor, but the conversation. The German tank crews who faced the Sherman often died without understanding why the battle had gone wrong. They had done their training, they had a superior gun in many cases, better armor in some cases, and genuine tactical skill. They had engaged an enemy they expected to confuse and scatter, but the enemy had not scattered. The enemy had talked to each other, pulled in artillery, repositioned their flanks, and closed the trap, and all of it had happened faster than the German command structure could respond. The radio did that. The next time you see footage of American Sherman tanks moving through the European countryside, look at the antenna, the small steel rod rising from the back of the turret. It doesn't look like a weapon. It doesn't look like armor. It doesn't look like anything that could change the outcome of a battle. But it changed the outcome of hundreds of them. And it raises a question worth sitting with. In every conflict, military, competitive, strategic, how often does the decisive advantage turn out to be something invisible, something the losing side never thought to study, never thought to fear because they were too busy counting guns? The Germans counted the Sherman's guns. They measured its armor. They calculated its weaknesses. They never thought to ask what the crew was saying to each other. That silence, in the end, was the most expensive mistake they made.